All right, hey everybody. I'm Jerry Wang from Airbnb, and today I'm going to be talking about kind of our Data Odyssey and pretty much how data engineering has evolved across Airbnb in the past decade or so. So before I get into that, I do want to acknowledge the incredible contributions from Databricks and Spark. I don't think the data engineering community would be where we are without them, so thank you for that. But I wanted to, But I do want to switch gears a little bit and talk to you about the paradox of modern-day compute. And so what do I mean by that? Well, why do we have the fastest compute in modern-day history, but we still have what I call the stakeholders' greatest gifts? And as data engineers, I think all of you will find these questions pretty comical, right? Why is this metric different in this dashboard? Do we have data for this? Where can I find it? What does this column name actually mean? I think we've all gotten that one. Why did this number change from yesterday? Which version of the table should I use, V1 or V2? Why is this data always 24 hours behind? And can you just make it land a little bit faster? And there's my all-time favorite. Can you just add one more column to this thing? All right? So as data practitioners and data producers, our natural inclination might be to treat these as technical bugs, right? We might decide to update a pipeline, write some documentation, reply to a Slack thread, something, right? But in reality, I think these are really just service deficiencies, right? There is a fundamental breakdown in the experience of data. And so if you get a question like, well, why is this data different? Why is X different? I think that's a breakdown in the product. I think if you get a question like, where is the data? I can't find it. That's a breakdown in the service that we're providing on top of the data itself. And so I think in the past decade plus of big data, right, we've been focusing primarily on the ETL, the pipelines, the tables, the assets we're producing. But in reality, I think we should be focusing on the products and services on top of those pipelines, on top of the ETL. We should be meeting people at how they need to consume that data. So let's retrospect a little bit. How do we get here? A lot of the things I want to talk about today are brief snippets into Airbnb's challenges that we've had over the past decade or so. And I think this actually matches the similar challenges across multiple tech companies I've been at, and they still persist in the industry. So let's start off with the beginning. In the beginning, there was big data, right? Every single company wanted to get as much data as they could. They wanted to figure out how all the big data stuff would work. And there was a lack of stability in the beginning, right? But Airbnb was a hyper-growth company, right? And so we wanted as much data as possible to integrate with the product, to drive analytics, to drive the machine learning. And so we use data engineers essentially as force multipliers to build out the initial versions of the data warehouse, the initial data models, the initial tooling, right? We want to go fast. We wanted to empower the company to use data as much as possible to drive the business. But that led to some questionable output, right? And so what came out of this is basically what I call high-cost islands of excellence, right? Every pipeline was slightly different. There was some nuance to it. Migrations were tough. Fixing it was tough. Updating it was tough. There was a high cost to owning these things, right? And this became the single source of, the greatest source of systemic technical debt at Airbnb. So in the beginning, right, pre-IPO, this was questionable, the data quality questionable, but it wasn't a disaster, right? And so we didn't have SLAs on tables, no DQ audits. We had duplicative tables and metrics, stuff you're all familiar with, right? But leading up to the IPO, this is not acceptable anymore, right? You can't report conflicting numbers to Wall Street, you'll get killed, right? And so we decided to rebuild and re-architect the entire data warehouse. And we did that with a focus on rigor. And we also decided to implement a 9-step certification program across the company for tables and metrics. And this is great. Right? We learned that if you really want to make a dent in data quality, it has to be company-wide effort. Leadership has to support it. You have to have the infrastructure tooling behind it, right? And at the end, Airbnb successfully did this, and we were able to trade in some high-end velocity for essentially high rigor tables, right? And this set us up to essentially start standardizing certain paid paths, which I'll talk about right now. Now, for anybody that has wanted to do DQ checks, implement CI checks, unit tests, integration tests, make sure that everything's fully up to spec, it's extremely costly, right? It takes up a lot of time. And this time can actually eat up what you can get out of a data engineer, right? Because if you're constantly stuck in KTL, what are you going to do? And so Airbnb decided to put more rigor behind the paid paths. And I think this is actually a great thing for us because this rigor allowed us to actually become more efficient. To paint you a picture, to paint you a picture, I think, sorry, I went backwards. To paint you a picture, we had about 100 plus user-owned and maintained frameworks sitting on top of Airflow. 100 different frameworks for creating ETL at Airbnb. Can you imagine how difficult it is to do anything there, right? And so we started creating more paid paths, right? So Minerva, for example, now is the company-wide de facto standard for creating metrics at Airbnb. It houses something like 45,000 metrics across the company. We started doing the same thing for paid path ETL tooling, right? We built an entire ecosystem for creating ETL. And what we learned is that we were able to shrink these islands of excellence into bigger continents of excellence, right? But this is great for us because what we learned is that velocity isn't really how fast a couple of really talented individuals can go. It's how fast the entire company can move without breaking things. And these higher quality pipelines allow the company to move a lot faster in the long run. Now, around this time, right, up until the point, we were all talking about collecting data. More data is better. We want more data so we can integrate into the product. That does not work anymore, right? Up until a certain point in time, we experienced a fundamental shift in the industry, right? The governance stuff came in. There was a bunch of lawsuits and regulatory stuff, and it was no longer about how much data you can collect quickly. It was about how much data that was in compliance that you had, right? And so the governance stuff came first, and then the analytics came after. And in fact, it was actually better to have no data than data that was not compliant. And for anybody that's done data governance, this stuff is really hard. There's a million things up there, and I didn't even bother memorizing it. It's really difficult. And there are even more 3 or 4 letter acronyms from regulators that I definitely don't remember, but it's a lot. And if you want to make a dent in this stuff, it has to be built behind the infrastructure. It has to be integrated as a first-class citizen, right? You can't do this after the fact. The days of collecting data and then figuring out what to do with it later doesn't work anymore. So, we're able to do this, and I think one of the other things we learned was that for data engineers, they became even more important because now the data modeling, you have to get more creative with it in order to capture the data correctly. But a decade later, we still have these stakeholders' greatest hits. These questions haven't really changed, except for that Minerva one, because the metrics one, because we have Minerva. But where do you go next, right? I think the next generation of data engineering moves towards services, right? And I think there are 4 distinct pillars to make a successful a data service, right? The first of which is using AI and machine learning as the center of how we consume and produce data. The second of which is getting rid of all this fragmentation across all of our different tools so they're cohesive, they have good interfaces, they're semantics-led, and they can lead towards something that's self-service. The third one is all that data management stuff and governance stuff that you saw earlier, a lot of that. And the fourth of which is operationalizing, automating a bunch of the scaling, the stability, the cost optimizations across the entire fleet. And with this, you can build towards data as a service. Now, here at Airbnb, we have made achieving data democracy a #1 goal, right? We have started delivering standardized metrics and products for users. So instead of just thinking about here's a table and here's a query and go use it however you want, we thought about how to meet people where they need the data. How does different facets of the company or consumers need to consume that data? And that's why we've decided to streamline and automate the scale, the speed, the governance, all that stuff into a unified data product. Okay, that's not me. So, and we're using AI to serve that, serve this data for the entire company. Now, if you think about those 4 different pillars of data, thankfully, our data strategy roadmap has led us to create some pretty awesome building blocks to support each pillar. Some notable ones include Minerva, 45,000 metrics across the company. We have Data Morph, that is our paid path ETL tooling. We are building a next generation orchestrator, and we have an awesome experimentation framework. On the data management side, we have a catalog of every single data asset in the company, not just tables. We're talking about everything, including S3 assets. We have automated data governance. We still have that certification program, and we have a single source of truth for our events and entities. And finally, we've taken all the guesswork out of automating our pipelines and the optimizations on the cluster. And we're using AI as a backbone, as a connective tissue to serve this for everybody. So here at Airbnb, we have made, we have gone all in on agentic, right? And so we've actually built a product called Data, which is a conversational workspace where you can use natural language to do your data discovery, generate queries. You can get queries back and run the queries for you. You can do your compute. It can generate your dashboards for you. It can do analysis for you. It can generate insights. It can search across the entire data catalog and things like that. And what that has done for us is it has significantly decreased the barriers of entry for anybody that wants to consume from the warehouse. You don't need to be an expert at SQL anymore. You don't have to know the nuances of how to consume a particular, from a particular API or whatever. You can use this conversational workspace for that. And so you might ask yourself, well, I'm a data engineer. Where do I fall into all of this, right? This seems like infrastructure stuff. But I actually think that, in the next decade or so, the rise of the full stack data engineer is here, right? And so in the traditional data engineering world, right, we might have been, middlemen of this giant cog of this giant machine, right? We're constantly waiting and working with like PMs to get requirements. We might need logging from a product eng. We might need to get metrics requirements from a DS. Have to work with infrastructure to get some kind of support from tooling or the cluster itself. And you repeat this loop forever, right? Every single time you get a business question. And it's too slow, right? And I think that with the advent of AI and the age of AI, the business is moving faster. So we have to move along at that velocity as well. And we've traditionally been stuck in this relay race of like handing off requirements, handing off context. It's this chain of custody, right, that repeats over and over, and it's too slow. And so I think AI changes this, right? We can now be force multipliers. We can be the connective tissue across the entire workflows, right? We don't have to wait along. We can kind of go out and do it, right? And so I think like the AI stuff, the LMs help really bridge the technical gaps and allows us to be the connective tissue for this entire workflow. What I mean by that is, as a data engineer, your number one priority might be data modeling and ETL, and I include all the stakeholder management stuff as part of data modeling, right? But in the new world, right, I think like we can do a lot more. We can be writing logging specs. We can be doing client instrumentation to get your own logging. We can be working on platform tooling. We can be generating your own analytical insights. You can own the semantic layer. And you could be building your own APIs that meet your customers at where they need to be. And so I think it's an incredible time to be a data engineer, to be honest. And I'm looking forward to seeing how the industry evolves. So that's my talk. If you're ready to be a full stack data engineer, we have a booth out there. Come talk to us. So, thanks.